Hello and welcome to the Mindset Mentor. I'm Tania Kolar. Thank you so much for joining me. As you know, our mindset is like a muscle that needs to be strengthened and conditioned, and because we really want you to cultivate your best life. And my special guest coming up in this hour is Dan Millman, who knows a heck of a lot about strengthening and conditioning not only the mind but the body. So Dan Millman is a former world champion athlete. Oh, I mean, the list goes on. And by the way, he's written, just about 18 books. Yep, that's right, 18 books. And we will discuss his latest book, which is called Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, which is truly a remarkable book that is a compilation of Dan's life, his work, and it's a memoir. And it's so poignant in, the evolution of his life, and from being a student and a teacher. And actually, it's almost like being a student and a teacher, and then being a student again, and a teacher again, and then going back to being a student. There's this real sort of ebb and flow, and it's so interesting. So make sure you stay tuned for this hour. You will absolutely gain some clarity and insight into your own personal journey, because of course we are all on our own journny. And you ever notice that the right people come into your life at exactly the right time, or the right book falls into your lap, and there's maybe one sentence that resonates so deeply with you. And in fact, Dan Millman's first book, which was called A Way of the Peaceful Warrior, was super instrumental in my start to spiritual, realization and my journey. And it's really interesting because it's a book that has come back into my mind many times. And there's this one beloved character called Socrates that makes a reappearance in his latest book. So how about we just dive into the conversation and say hello and welcome to the fabulous Dan Millman. Dan, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on the Mindset Mentor today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy to be sharing with you today, Tanya. It's funny. I like the title Mindset Mentor because, of course, my book involves four primary mentors in my own life, even though we've all had mentors, role models, and examples to follow in our lives. Um, but the idea of mindset, brings to mind a favorite quotation about two men looked out of prison bars. One saw mud and the other saw stars. And both mud and stars exist, of course. We don't want to ignore the mud or deny it, or we'll step in it. But we also want to remember the stars. And I think that's, in a sense, that metaphorically addresses the idea of the mindset.
Yeah, I love that. So beautifully said. Everything in life really is based on our perception and our perspective, and of course, our learning and our journey, and all of it, an accumulation, which I think is so perfect because your book is really an accumulation of your lifelong learning and passion and just upbringing. So it's quite interesting that you had these incredible four role models, which we'll delve into, and you give them some beautiful names, and I'll let you explain that. But before you had, those key mentors, your mentors and your role models actually started really young for you at the age of, I think it was 7 or something, even before that. So, I'd love to talk about that. But actually, first things first, if we can just share with the listeners, what does it mean to live with a peaceful heart and a warrior spirit?
Well, that's a very good question to start with. It provides a context for those who aren't familiar with my work. And I'll jump back just a little further. When I was a professor at Oberlin College, I was teaching in the physical education department, and I was teaching a martial arts course. And the course involved Aikido and Tai Chi, kind of a entry level approach to these internal arts. And I was going to call the course The Way of the Warrior. This is back in 1973 or 4. But it didn't seem to fit quite because these are internal arts. They're not aggressive arts. They're more receptive. And so then a light bulb moment, we've all had those. It struck me. I said, why don't I call it The Way of the Peaceful Warrior? It seemed to balance the idea. And so that's why when I first came up with the term peaceful warrior, and years later when I wrote the book, that just seemed to come to the fore as a title, as a capsule, a vessel for what I had to share. Um, and the reason I refer to everyone as peaceful warriors in training, you, me, everybody I've seen, is because we're all seeking to live with a peaceful heart, a sense of serenity, equanimity, and balance in the chaos of the daily news. Um, but at the same time, I think a part of us recognizes there are moments in which we need a warrior spirit. And it's not just about fighting, except perhaps the demons inside, like insecurity, fear, self doubt,
Mm.
those kinds of things. But it's more about rolling up our sleeves and marching in willingly, openly, engaging the challenges of everyday life. That's what I mean by a warrior spirit. So it seemed like a natural approach to titling the culminating work of my career with that title.
Yeah, it's so perfect. And oftentimes, I think people don't realize that the word peaceful and warrior can exist simultaneously, right? And I think that as we experience challenges in life, sometimes we find it hard to give ourselves permission to enjoy the good because we feel that we need to be locked into that. It's one or the other. But the fact that it can be all encompassing is such a beautiful thing.
Well, and even the good, even recognizing what is the good, we'd like to play God and know what should be in our lives.
Mm.
This should happen, this shouldn't happen, that shouldn't have happened. And yet, well, you remember the story from Way of the Peaceful Warrior, perhaps. It's gotten around. I didn't make it up. So it existed before I wrote
Hmm.
the book and has gotten around about the old man, and he had a son and they had a farm and they had one horse and the horse ran away and all the neighbors said, terrible luck, it's so bad. And the farmer just shrugged, said, who knows, you can't tell about these things. Well, soon after, the horse came back leading 5 wild horses into the corral, and the neighbor said, what good fortune. And he said, I don't know, you never can tell. And the son, trying to tame one of the horses afterward, fell off and broke his leg. And all the neighbors commiserated. Oh, it's too bad. What bad luck. And the farmer just shrugged, because soon after, the army came to conscript all the young men for war, where the son would probably be killed, but they couldn't take him because he had a broken leg. So good luck, bad luck. How do we even know what is the good? We have these assumptions. And that's why I think as far as that theme of mindset, I recommend as a practical exercise that people, when they run into a difficulty, a challenge, um, it's a good thing to ask, in what way might this be perfect? A
Mm.
perfect part of my process, my learning, unfolding. As a peaceful warrior, I view daily life as a form of spiritual weight training. If you don't lift any weights, you don't get any stronger. So daily life, it gives it a purpose. It's to temper our spirit, and we grow. Every adversity, if we look back on that we've faced in our lives, we can realize that we're a little bit wiser and a little bit stronger now, having done that. And it becomes a metaphor for the next one we may face and how to approach that.
Oh, so beautifully said. Absolutely. And I think that it also allows us to be more compassionate, both with the self and other people. When we go through those challenges, you have, a different understanding of that firsthand. And I know in my own life, my greatest challenges, and I certainly believe in everyone's life, that your greatest challenges are your greatest blessings, your greatest rewards. There's a gift in those challenges, and it, may take a long time to figure out what that gift
Sure.
is, right? Sometimes even decades. But what I've also come to understand is that I now, it's based on your advice as well as just what you just said, is that I look for, the gift in the moment. And instead of looking at something like, wow, this could be really terrible, it's like, what is the gift? And I welcome it in. And I think that it's just a matter of, again, conditioning and making the shift in mindset, which can also change your physiology, right? I mean, the mind and the body are so connected. I think it's important to embrace both. So I'd love to talk to you about, the book itself, of course, and writing 18 books. So what started? What was the impetus for the first book that, by the way, was a bestseller and also was adapted into a movie, Peaceful Warrior with Nick Nolte?
Well, I guess it came out of probably my emerging adolescence and the success I found in the gymnastics field when I was a young man, and then coaching. Um, I was so much into self-improvement. And there's
Mm.
certainly nothing wrong with self-improvement. The better, if each of us is a cell on the body of Earth, the better each cell is, the better it is for the Earth. So I recommend self-improvement, being the best self we can be. But at the same time, I mean, after studying 30 days to a more powerful vocabulary, sleight of hand, ventriloquism, acrobatics, juggling, um, uh, I read books on speed mathematics and speed reading. I took courses and memory courses. I was so much into learning and improving. One day it struck me that it was so self-oriented. I realized that no matter how much I improved myself, only one person benefited. But if
Mm.
I could somehow help improve the lives of other people, then that made my life even more meaningful. I didn't know yet how I was going to do that, but it turned out that it ended up in the field of writing. If I could write a book that some people might like, and that would extend what I had learned. So I think my commitment to sharing what I learned, not just learning it for myself, but sharing it with other people, that really lasted. I continued to learn and evolve, but it was all about how can I use this to share. And I think that's what opened me up to meeting the four particular heavy hitters that I studied with over a period of about 20 years.
Beautiful. And I think a contribution and how we can serve humanity is one of the greatest gifts that we can, give to the planet and of course ourselves. And you certainly have embodied that so beautifully and candidly have shared and talked about some of your own struggles, personal battles, whether they be physical or emotional. And also, you touched on childhood and some bullying that certainly had an impact in your life, but also served you very well and has brought you and to where you were essentially in the world of gymnastics and being a world champion. So let's talk a little bit about that. And first of all, how can a child, experience that bullying and go from that to being and competing as a world athlete?
Hmm. Well, there was a moment in time when I was about, as you mentioned earlier, you referred to the age of 7 years old. I think I was seven, and
Mm.
I used to follow around a fellow named Steve Usaw. He was streetwise. He was 3 years older than I was, so a 10-year-old. He knew his way around, and he and some friends and I were climbing in a house under construction. During the weekend, nobody was there, so we would climb among the rafters and get up on the roof. And Steve noticed a sand pile far below, a big sand pile. It was about 20 feet below. It looked pretty high standing up on the roof. And he leaped off, followed by his friends who were about his age. And we've all had this experience. I so much wanted to follow them and do that, but I was afraid. So I'd go to the edge and back up and go to the edge and back up. And finally, Steve yelled something at me that I never forgot. He said, "Dan, just stop thinking and jump." And I realized somehow I could do that. I could just not think about it so much, bend my knees, lean forward, and push. And I did. And of course, we spent the next hour climbing up and jumping off, climbing up. It was just a lot of fun. Um, but that moment really would serve me later on. Getting out of my own head. There's a saying in the martial arts, in combat and in life: if you start thinking too much, you're dead. So not overthinking. It's good. We have the human capacity of thought, of course, to reflect and learn and use our minds. Nothing wrong with that. But sometimes there's a saying, you don't want to think without acting or act without thinking. There's a balance there. So that was one incident that led me to make a decision as I got older. You see, my mother loved to work out in the world. And so she got me into kindergarten as soon as she could.
Mm.
And I was always the youngest child in class in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and all the way through my schooling. And because I was younger than the others, and I was also smaller in stature, which was good for gymnastics, not so good in basketball.
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
but because of that, and the tendency to talk a lot, which a lifelong habit apparently, um, it attracted the attention of some bullies, which comes to your question. And um, I was threatened and I was afraid. They were bigger. Sometimes they had friends with them. And because of that, I made the decision to jump in to some training. And I asked my father if he could help me learn to defend myself. And he showed me a few things. Um, but he also brought me to a boxing gym and had me put on some gloves and hit the bag and the heavy bag. And I was little still. I was probably about 9 years old or 10 then. And I discovered something very quickly in training in boxing at that age. I really didn't like getting hit much or hitting other people.
Mm,
So I ended up in judo, which judo, the word means the gentle way. It's using other people's momentum and so on. And so I learned to throw people larger than myself and and use that element of martial arts, which led to karate and Okinawa Te. Think Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid. I studied Okinawan style karate, and later on in my life, Aikido and Tai Chi and some other arts as well. So those bullies, I should write them a thank you note if I knew where they were, because they gave me the gift of an interest in self-defense, martial arts, the warrior's way, and helped shape my life. So it all serves, looking back. They say you can only understand life looking backwards, but you have to live it forwards. And it's also been said, I'm sure you've heard this,
mhm.
we're like cars driving at night, and we can only see as far as our headlight beam. But in that way, we can still make a long journey. So that's what it's felt like in my life. By the way, I'll add one more thing, that I don't presume that everyone wants to run out and grab my new book because they want to read about Dan Millman, someone they may not have even heard of. But what the subtitle of my book is, The True Story of My Spiritual Quest. And as you referred to before, Tania, really, there's a trail of breadcrumbs. We share a certain, there's that saying, one light, many lamps, one journey, many paths. So we're each on our own path, but we're kind of traveling up that same journey to the mountaintop. And so I believe that the way I wrote the book, it can help inform the paths and illuminate the paths of other people, maybe vaccinate them against some of the pitfalls along the path.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. And I love that even in the dedication, you refer to, the trail of breadcrumbs. And it is so beautiful because it can guide us. We learn so much from each other. Every moment, every day is a learning opportunity. And it's just a matter of, how will we perceive that? And will we actually, take the lesson and move forward in a way that serves us, or, choose to be blinded to the situation? Really fascinating. So I would love to talk about your four famed mentors that you have in the book and what they represent to you. So if you can just briefly introduce them, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll dive deep into the impact that they've had on your life. So let's start with the first mentor
Sure,
for you.
sure. Well, as an overview, um, I met them at the right times. You know that saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Hmm.
But many people misunderstand that. They think when they're somehow deserving enough, or they've suffered enough, or they've prepared well enough, then a teacher like Socrates, like the old man I met at that gas station one night, that he will appear or she will appear and guide us or kick us up the path. But I believe when the student is ready, defined by paying attention,
Hmm.
then the teacher appears everywhere. And I do relate in the book an important lesson that stayed with me my whole life, that I learned from watching a cloud drift through the sky. So there are there are teachers everywhere. Books are our teachers, other
Hmm.
people, animals, and the natural world has always been my primary teacher. But when around 1973, I got a grant from Oberlin College. I was a professor there at the time, and there was a grant the college was giving for comparative studies around the world. You had to travel around the world. to get this grant. And I said, that sounds good. And it was a
I'm
point in
in.
my life. Yeah, it was an open ticket. You could buy they paid an X amount. You could just travel at any schedule, any flights that were available on this airline. And it was Pan Am at the time. In any case, so I was going to fly back to California, where I lived, from Ohio, ironically traveling west to go to the mysterious east. And the next stop was going to be Hawaii and then Japan and so on. But while I was in California, I happened to call an old teammate of mine, an old gymnastics teammate from Cal, UC Berkeley, and Herb, his name was, and Herb said, Dan, he said, I'm glad you called. I just completed this amazing training. If there's any way you can do it, drop everything and go do this. Well, it was a 40-day intensive training, 40 days in a row. Who has time for that these days? And it was created by a man I call the professor, the first of the four mentors. I call him the professor because he created a school for enlightenment, a technological approach using spiritual exercises, inner work, gathered not just from Hindu tradition, or Advaita Vedanta, not just from the Zen tradition, or the Sufis, or Christian mystics. It was a global heritage. He was exposed to an unusual degree of different things, and he could weigh which kinds of meditations. And I learned 30 or 40 different meditations for different purposes. What kind of breathing exercises combined with relaxation will and movement will be overall best serve the body, and so on. So that's what I have to emphasize. This was the best approach to what you do is what gives you the results. You have to do the exercises, do the work, do the insight work. Some people have heard of the Enneagram. There were best-selling books for a while. That all stemmed from him, the professor. He created the modern day insights. And finally, all the Enneagram authors finally acknowledged, yes, he was the source of the material. They attributed it to Jesuits or the Sufis, and they dealt with and Gurdjieff, who created the shape, the idea of the Enneagram. But anyway, we learned later on in advanced training with the professor after the 40-day training, which was pretty incredible at the time. We learned to look at someone's face in even lighting and determine what's now called personality type, but it was called the ego fixation, a sensitive point that resulted in unconscious strategies, the way we lived and our limitations. So I know I'm hitting a lot of points here, but I'm giving a flavor for the kind of insight work, body work, mental work, breath work that we did. And then you might say, well, wow, are you continuing in this mode and doing the different trainings? Because one training came after the next. He said enlightenment after the 40 days. Well, it didn't quite happen. I was going through some personal difficulties.
Yeah.
My first marriage, I was married once before my marriage to Joy, the love of my life. We've been married 46 years now.
Beautiful.
But early on, that was my training wheel marriage. I was still immature. And despite all the things I had learned, I found the inner work was only getting me better at doing inner work. But there seemed to be a firewall between that and everyday life. So I know I'm going on in a little bit more detail than I'm going to for the other mentors, but just to give a flavor, I had done the best technology available. And I'm aware of many different trainings and approaches and methods today that claim to be the key. Change your beliefs, change your life, and so on and so forth. And many sophisticated methods and systems. Well, I went that route. I really exhausted it. And I found that it wasn't the answer. It improved me. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was more relaxed. My body felt different. We did this bone massage for 6 hours to make the body more like a child's again, to really free up areas and so on. But it didn't work. And again, to make this a little shorter, I eventually turned and discovered the guru. And the guru he's a real person, of course. He was really a very, very popular and an amazing, humorous, brilliant teacher. He wrote a number of absolutely books that still today are classics. However, anyway, I spent 8 years with the guru.
Wow.
And I mean, Joy and I both, she was with me the whole time. My wife was. And in fact, she, as you know, she weighs in in this book. She says, Dan, I saw things a little differently from you. Maybe I could write a little. I said, great. So she wrote a few pages in the book as well about her particular views
Well,
of that
I
time.
I love that, and because I find it so interesting that when we are on a pursuit for improving ourselves and whatever that looks like for someone and whatever path they choose, it can be very difficult to have and maintain a relationship when the other person is choosing to just stay fixed. I think that when we all grow and evolve together in a relationship, and that could be friendship, marriage, what have you, it's there's a beautiful flow, and there's a lot of barriers that will emerge when we are growing at different rates, and sometimes we have to recognize that friendship or relationship has now come to an end, and sometimes we hang on for dear life because we don't love change, but it's in that change that life flourishes, and you can grow together, or choose a different path. And I think that's so telling in taking action. So you talked about taking action. We have to do. We can have all these theories, like you spent a lot of time, obviously in your pursuit of knowledge, and you really approached it in a way like you've approached gymnastics. I mean, I read the complete memoir from front cover to back, and I was exhausted, mentally exhausted, going, "Oh my gosh, that is a lot of work." It was almost like you were the Olympic spiritual adventurer, right? So you really put a lot of time and dedication into your spiritual quest, and I admire that and I honor that. And it's beautiful to see that you had Joy alongside with you to be a part of that, to embrace that. And we'll talk more about that when we come back. So we're going to take a short little break here on the Mindset Mentor. I'm Tania Kolar, and you just heard from Dan Millman, who is an 18-time author. He was a former world athlete and also martial art teacher and coach and professor. So really beautiful knowledge compiled together in his latest book, which is Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, and the subtitle is A True Story of My Spiritual Path. And the My, of course, is the fabulous Dan Millman. So stay with us here. We'll be back on Sauga 960. Well, happy Thursday and welcome back to the Mindset Mentor. I'm Tania Kolar. Super excited today to have my special guest, Dan Millman, joining me on the show, who is an 18-time author. His latest book, which we're discussing today in depth, which is a memoir of really his life work and his experience, which is extraordinary. It's called Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, a true story of my spiritual path. And it's such a, boy, does that path ever spiral. I'm telling you, I mean, there's highs and there's lows. And Dan, it's so great to have you on the show. And I'm happy to just pick up the conversation. I know one of the things that you love quite a bit and that you use a lot are quotes in your life and koans. So I know you have one, ready to go for us as we continue the conversation.
Well, it just came up by coincidence. I just posted it on my Facebook page this morning,
Mm-hmm.
Tanya. And you were referring to in relationships, a change, one person changing and the other, it puts a pressure on them and it can cause some perturbations in a relationship. Fortunately, my wife, Joy, was willing. Our love was such that she was willing to go through everything I went through with me, and engaged and embraced it as well. It wasn't, she took responsibility for her choices, and so it was all in. But talking about change and the challenges of it, this morning I posted a quote by Barbara Kingsolver: the changes we dread most may contain our salvation. And so, life comes at us in waves of change that we can't predict or control, but we can learn to surf those changes and learn to go with them. We don't have to pretend to like them when they happen, a difficulty, but we have to keep that thread of attention. We talked about this before, that it is a gift. Every adversity has a hidden gift strength, wisdom, and perspective. So yeah, that's kind of where we were, and I was describing the four different mentors, but I need to also remind people it's not about comparing anybody's life to mine. My life may illuminate, in my experiences, I was willing to go through the work. And also, I came in a time through the 60s, early 70s, when I came of age. So I happened to be in a time when a lot of these things were available. And so it's just like we may not necessarily go to Tahiti, but if we read about someone, their adventures in Tahiti, in a way we experience that. So that's what I wanted to share through the new book, to help people get a perspective. And that's why I wrote it primarily. So after the professor, the guru, was a totally different approach. He said, I'd rather beat you with a stick than tell you to meditate your way to enlightenment. He had an entirely different approach. And so it was more about surrendering to the divine, right, going right to the source through this presumably illumined being. And he showed every indication, the kind of illumined wisdom that kept us around for almost 8 years, studying his teachings and living in a community household, not in an ashram, not separate from the world, but in San Francisco. We lived in a household. We had regular jobs. That was a requirement. And we ate a healthful diet, did regular exercise. It was part of this way of life, very wholesome, healthful way of life. But for various reasons I go into in the book, I eventually, after 8 years, we decided it was time to move on. That's when I was done with teachers at this point. I said, I've had two really big teachers and spent 10 years, doing this work. But then, just through a coincidence, I ended up coming across a man who called himself the Warrior Priest. And he brought me back into my confidence, into ways to teach more effectively. So the style and the substance, very practical, insightful material. In fact, I didn't write another book after Way of the Peaceful Warrior for 10 years. I felt I'd said what I had to say. I was done. But after I met the Warrior Priest, I started writing a book every year or two. And that's when a prolific period of life. I was so excited about this new information about the three selves and models of how to understand ourselves and so on. And he was a martial arts teacher, metaphysical healer, and so on. Fascinating fellow. And kind of like, he described himself as a cheerleader to the soul. And that's what I needed about that time, after coming off the whole community, the guru thing.
So when you had met the warrior priest, and then the other mentors, and there's the fourth mentor as well, who's really impactful. Did you sort of renounce what you learned from the previous ones, or did you sort of add on? Or did you eliminate some of the things that you thought were true in the moment?
Good question. There's that old Zen story about before you can learn anymore, you have to empty your cup, and then I can pour more in. Well, actually, you don't need to empty your cup. You just need a bigger cup.
I love it. Yeah.
No, I'm grateful for everything I learned from the professor and the guru. Absolutely. But it was adding on, as you say. It was nuances and a different approach. They had radically different approaches. And so the time of the Warrior Priest was an adventure. Everything was exciting with him. At an advanced training, we did a spiritual growth through knife fighting. Actually, we were tested and attacked with knives, and we had to deal with that. And I described that in the book and so on. But he had very different approach. And then, of course, there are circumstances where we had to part ways. And then came... And remember, I was with these people in depth. I was all in other words. I wasn't just collecting spiritual initiations. These were real in-depth experiences.
Like the spiritual boot camp that you talk about, right? It's exactly that. I think your whole lifelong pursuit of spirituality and the quest for more was really a boot camp.
It was like a boot camp. That was my dedication. That was my total focus at that time, despite, not knowing what I was going to do with my life yet. But by the time I met the Warrior Priest, I was getting a sense of it. that I was here to teach. I was called to teach and share. So that began my initiation, my apprenticeship in a way. I taught gymnastics, of course. I'd done that for years. And gymnastics training, by the way, you referred to that. That was really the beginning of my spiritual training. Because athletes learn to focus the mind, they learn the law of presence, they learn to apply the law of process, step by step, and reality. You know, how you train, the results are in proportion to the efforts you put in, and so on. So that was the beginning of my spiritual training, and I
Wow.
described some elements of that in as my days as a coach at Stanford University. But then the sage. Again, another coincidence, synchronicity. I ended up meeting the sage. I was already an established teacher by this time and an author, but he had something that was a very different approach to reality, and it brought me back to earth. Let me just say that it brought me it. That's why I recommend that we live with our head in the clouds, but our feet on the ground. And he showed me how to bring my feet back on the ground, on solid earth. And in fact, somebody approached me about then and said, Dan, I read your book, Way of the Peaceful Warrior, your first book, and now I want to do spiritual practices, but I don't have time. He said, I have a wife and 3 children and a full-time job. And he came to understand his work, his wife, his children were his primary spiritual practices. The arena of the peaceful warrior is everyday life, not somewhere else. And so he came to understand that. And the demands of everyday life will demand more and develop us more than sitting in a cave and meditating. I know, because I've done both.
It's like having, this incredible knowledge, but not applying any of it, right? And it's finally about when you apply it, that's where really the magic happens in life.
Yes, exactly. And so that was the round through these 4 master teachers.
Beautiful.
But again, we've all had our teachers. We've all had, and it's important we don't compare ourselves to other people. It's a disrespect for our own process. Someone once said, I can't write a book commensurate to Shakespeare, but I can write a book by me. And that's what guided me through my whole life.
I love that. And I think that's where a lot of people get stopped in life is the I'm not good enough, constantly comparing to everyone else around them. And that can immobilize us. So how did you sort of shut out the competition, being a world champion and a gymnast, and even in teaching? How did you help other people to sort of block that noise and that external chatter out?
Well, I reminded something I learned when I was a coach. I noticed that when I was teaching beginning gymnastics at Stanford, some people learned somersaults, let's say, faster than others. But I also noticed that those who took longer to learn it often learned it better than those who learned it faster. So I realized we have to respect our own way of learning, our own way of living. We're not here to come, because if we compare ourselves to other people, we're either going to feel superior or inferior. And I see so many depressed young people today because other people seem to be having more fun on their Instagram page, on their Facebook. They're showing their best self. Look at what fun I'm having and how I'm traveling. And so then we feel less than. But if we just stop comparing and start respecting our own process, our own way of doing things, one of the central tenets of the approach to living that I teach is that there is no best book. There is no best teacher, no best path, religion, philosophy, diet, or exercise system. There's only the best for each of us at a given time of our life. Life is an experiment. We have to find out what works for us and live our life, not someone else's.
Oh, I love that. So beautifully said. And I know in my own life, simple things that maybe didn't resonate at one point, when I've reread that book or I've watched that movie again, it deeply resonated. And I thought, well, how did I not see this at that time? But I was a different person at that time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So beautifully said. I love that. So, you talked about, there was something that popped up, and now I forget. So I'll just talk about something else. It'll come back. It'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that you have become a student and a teacher, and that cycle sort of continued over and over and over again. I believe that we're all lifelong learners. But what was it like for you to be in some of those what we would call low points, because there really is no high or low, it's perception, right? But in those
Sure.
moments, and even let's talk about when you basically shattered your thigh bone being a
Mm.
gymnast. I mean, that could be really debilitating mentally, right? Not only
Right.
physically, but mentally as well. How did you handle that?
Right. Those who've read my first book or seen the movie, and of course, I relate the actual events that did happen as I described in my first book. And I was on a motorcycle. I wasn't driving the way they showed in the movie. I was a rather careful driver.
Mm.
But nonetheless, it was dusk and somebody didn't see me, turned in front of me, and I shattered my right femur, my right thigh bone, into about 30 or 40 pieces, the doctor
Oof.
said. And there was a surgery, major surgery, and a bone, a nail put down the middle of my bone, and so on. So it was quite disruptive, you might say, in today's language, and very painful. And I had no idea whether I'd ever do what I'd been training for 10 years, toward the Olympics and so on. But that that actually, I might not be speaking with you today if that hadn't happened,
Mm.
because it shook me up. And of course, I'm pointing up right now. I started asking bigger questions about life. I jumped out of the bulletproof 20 somethings where I could do anything and I was invulnerable,
Yep.
and realized I was a mortal being. And did my life, was it going to count for something? So it made me more reflective, I think. However, I do not recommend fractures as a method of personal and spiritual development. But
Yeah,
it, but
not the
it for
best
me,
route.
it had that effect. So we can just, they say life will lift us up or grind us down depending on how we respond to the events of our everyday life.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, most people, I would think that were in your situation would actually give up on their pursuits and their career as a gymnast and becoming that world champion. So I think it goes far beyond the physical, and it's the mindset and the shift, and it's remembering that we have the ability to move forward no matter what. Right. Obviously, we can't
Yes.
control the external circumstances, but we can always control what's happening on the inside. And at that time, obviously, you were younger in your on that spiritual journey, and still evolving and learning. But you had such strength, and maybe like an innate knowing. Did you find that some of that was just innate to move you forward?
Probably just innate stubbornness. And
Yeah. Yeah.
some people may need to pivot. They may not
Yeah.
recover from an injury, and they pivot and go in a different direction and
Yep.
end up finding out the perfect direction, the new. Uh, but for me, it was a stubbornness, a persistence. I wanted to see. I didn't know what would happen, but I said, "Let's see,
Hmm.
let's try," because we cannot control the outcomes in our life, but we can control our efforts. And by making a good effort, we have a better chance of getting the outcomes that we like, over
Hmm.
not making the effort. As was it Wayne Gretzky or Michael Jordan said, you make 0% of the shots you don't take. And
Yeah.
the sage reminded me of this, the fourth of my mentors. He had a wonderful quote. He said, when running up a hill, it's okay to give up, quit as many times as you want, as long as your feet keep moving.
Oh, yes, I love that. I love that. So good. And I think that it's really important to just embrace where we're at and not to get too stuck on criticizing and thinking that we should do better and why aren't we this successful and why we ask those questions oftentimes. But I think it's so important just to take ownership to move forward and to find that voice and to forgive ourselves for some of the past mistakes that we think that we've made and or we're not at. And one of my favorite quotes by Mark Twain is forgiveness is the fragrance of violet sheds on the heel that crushed it. Oh, so
Mm,
beautiful, so
beautiful.
deep
I'd
and
never heard that.
beautiful.
Wow. Wonderful
Oh,
quote.
right. So, what about for you and forgiveness in your life? So, I'm thinking of some of the stories that you talk about in the book, from bullying to even, I believe it was the warrior priest mentor who you had this great connection with, and then all of a sudden he cut you off, and for really no apparent reason that you were aware of, and that can be. Very much like a lot of the experiences that the listeners experience in their life, that sometimes they're just not getting the response that they want. So, was forgiveness a part of that for your journey moving forward?
Well, some people ask me about the word meaning, and we make up our meanings. So I use the word purpose instead.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, I'm not really good at answering whys, the why question, or the idea of forgiveness. Because to me, forgiveness, I guess the sage once said, if we really see ourselves realistically, maybe our major business is not forgiving others, but in asking forgiveness. And
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of an interesting twist on it. Because so to me, it's more of an, I don't know, it's, I will forgive you, my parents. I will forgive you for what the slight you've done to me by not saying something that pleased me or displeased me. I don't even deal with forgiveness. To me, everybody we meet and everything that we encounter is a part of our process.
Mm-hmm.
And so forgiveness never even comes into it. It's just part of my life. How can I use this to lift?
Ooh, how can I use this to lift? I love that. That's a great question. And I think that if we all ask ourselves more empowering questions, we get a better response. The universe is always listening, and we have the reticular activating system of the brain, and what we choose to focus on, we're going to get more of. And
Right.
I find that throughout your journey, there was this incredible direct and persistent focus of always moving forward no matter what. And it seems as though you had many people show up in your life that, facilitated that next step for you. So we really don't need to know all the answers, and the how things are going to happen. We just need to let them evolve and welcome them in and take action when they do show up.
Right. Well, again, the sage had three guidelines for living wisely and well. He said,
Mm-hmm.
accept your thoughts and emotions, positive or negative, as natural to you in that moment. They're just
Mm-hmm.
arising. Two, focus on a constructive goal. What do you want? What is your goal? And three, do what needs to be done in line with your goal. Whether or not you're feeling motivated or have the right thoughts or the right feelings, what do you need to do? We've all done things. We've all taken out the trash or done our work when we weren't feeling like it. We know what that's
Mm-hmm.
like.
Mm-hmm.
So the feelings come, we acknowledge them, we accept them as they are, as we would in meditation. But meanwhile, what do I need to do in doing it? Maybe that's the key question in life. What do I need to do now?
What do I need to do now? Such a beautiful question. And I find, you talked about, knowing what you want, and some people just don't know what they want. But I would say that really everybody has the answers. I think we truly know what we want. We just need to sometimes just step out of our own way so that we can tap in intuitively to what that actually is or what that feels like. Everybody has that intuitive feeling. So we all know it's certainly there. Now, we don't have too much time left, so I want to ask you about the beloved Socrates, who was in your first book, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, and also the movie titled Peaceful Warrior, and makes a reappearance in your latest book, Peaceful Heart Warrior Spirit. So my question to you is, so when you first wrote, about Socrates, you kind of left this open to, does he really exist? Doesn't he exist? And you actually reveal the truth and the identity in this book. So why was it important for you now to reveal that truth?
Well, because this is my culminating work, I believe, I
Yeah.
felt it was time. There's enough illusions in the new age, and today the issues of truth. We can have our own opinions. We don't
Mm-hmm.
can't have our own facts, and what is true, what is not true, what is real, what is authentic, and that's been very important to me throughout my life.
Yeah.
And so I created a teaching novel, Way of the Peaceful Warrior, which was based on an old man I actually met about 3 in the morning, as I describe in the new book. This is a true story, the
Mm-hmm.
entire one, the memoir. Um, and he reminded me of the old Greek sage, so I started calling him Socrates. However, I didn't really spend as much time with him as I indicated in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
I met him that once, and he inspired me in certain ways. I remembered him 14 years later when I wrote the book. And just like in the tradition of Frodo and Gandalf, and Mr. Miyagi and Daniel San in The Karate Kid, and King Arthur and Merlin, and Don Juan the Brujo of Carlos Castaneda.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there has been this tradition of stumbling students stumbling toward the light, and mentors who guide them. So it just seemed like a natural way to convey that through Peaceful Warrior. Just having me as some young guy, 30 something guy when I wrote the book, tell people about this and this and this, it came with more authority, more spiritual authority when my teacher, my literary teacher in the book, Socrates, could convey this to me and the reader could join in the exploration. So that's why I chose that as a method to present in the book. And Socrates has become a beloved character, still beloved in my own heart. My daughter, Sierra, who is an author, editor now, she's an audio producer, she did some editing on the book and said, hey, Dad, why don't you have some dialogues with Socrates? And that appealed to me. I said, that'll be fun. And I had a great time writing them. So as a debrief for each mentor, Socrates appears and we have a conversation.
Yeah, it's so beautifully done, and I loved to follow that journey from the first book to the 18th book, and to see the progression. Really quite beautiful. Now, I would love to ask you, for the listeners, what kind of advice can you impart to someone who is either beginning their spiritual quest or is continuing their spiritual quest to stay on course?
One of my books is called The Four Purposes of Life, and I go into various kinds of purposes. But let me just, in answer to your question, touch on the last one. Perhaps the most important purpose of all is the one that appears to us moment to moment.
Yeah.
We may not always know what our cosmic purpose is and our ultimate goal, but we know what we want to do right now. My purpose is very clear in this moment, sharing with you. Your purpose is clear, and your listeners and your viewers their purpose is clear in this moment. So if we just focus on the purpose in front of us, it will appear, and follow that course.
Oh, I love that. So beautifully said. I think that, every moment there's so much opportunity to learn. This morning I was literally peeling eggs, right? I had some boiled eggs and I was peeling the first egg and I thought, I don't know why it was so difficult. It was shattered in all these different pieces and it was almost like the shells were glued on, and I was peeling away at it, right? And I found myself getting angry at the egg. And I'm like, an egg is making me angry. And then I just I noticed it. And then I finished peeling it. I went on to the next egg. And then I just laughed because the next egg, I peeled it almost like in one clean shell. And I thought, what a great lesson. I was like, it's just paying attention to what's happening on the inside. And I think it's so important to sort of tap into that. And that seems, Dan, that you've always been very, well, maybe not always, that's probably a strong word, but you've been receptive to what shows up. And, again, it's so important to embrace that.
Right. And I'm still learning. I relate incidents, humorous incidents in the book. We're all still learning. We're all in process. So
yes.
Peaceful Warriors in training.
Oh, I love that. All right. So where can the viewers get more information about you and your book and your courses and your movie, Dan?
Yeah, the best place, I think, is peacefulwarrior.com.
Wonderful. It has been an absolute pleasure having you here on the Mindset Mentor. And thank you for your openness and sharing and the vulnerability and the candor that you have throughout your book and the lessons that contain so much deep wisdom and knowledge.
Thank you, Tanya. It's been a pleasure.
All right, everyone. So that's a wrap for the Mindset Mentor. And make sure that you continue to strengthen and condition your mindset. And remember, in the words of Dan Millman and Dan Millman's friend, stop overthinking, stop thinking, and just jump. You've got this. Stay tuned. We'll be back here on Sauga 960.